It is that time of year again, folks. The anniversary bundle's out, and the new event campaign has begun, so it is time to update some top 10 lists. So we're going to be looking at my choices for top 10 C-Store ships in Star Trek Online as of March of 2024. Now, before I start, I do want to make it clear that there is going to be some overlap between this list and last year's list because, well, Cryptic only releases so many C-Store ships in a year, and, not every one of them is going to be top tier. So if you watched last year's top 10 list, you are probably going to see some repeats. But don't worry, there is some new stuff in here too. The first ship on this list is also probably one of the oldest that you'll see on this list as well, which is kind of crazy to me because I still think of this as a fairly new ship, even though that it's actually like 5 years old. The Gagarin Miracle Worker Battlecruiser. This ship is a Miracle Worker Battlecruiser with a 5-3 weapons layout. A 5-3 layout is always preferable on a cruiser like this so you can better maintain a forward-facing firing build. Some people are a little iffy on Miracle Worker ships because their ship mechanic, the innovation mechanic, really just isn't that great because it's very RNG based. But an important thing to remember about Miracle Worker ships is that their ship mechanic is kind of toned down in comparison to others because Miracle Worker ships also get a universal console slot. That's just built in even before you upgrade it to Tier 6X. So a full Miracle Worker ship will always have one additional console slot in comparison to other ships. Though in the case of the Gagarin and a few other ships on this list, make sure you upgrade to the fleet version of the ship, because the base C-Store version will be lacking one console slot which will be regained once you upgrade to the fleet version. So a number of you might view that as a downside for this ship because to get the fleet ship version you'll need to be in a fleet with a sufficiently leveled shipyard. Then you'll need to have one fleet ship module, and that's assuming you own the C-Store version. It's 5 fleet ship modules if you don't own the C-Store version, along with 20,000 fleet credits. And the fleet ship version does not come with the console or starship trait that come with the original C-Store version of the Gagarin. And while the console is nothing special, the starship trait is actually really nice off of this thing, which is Entwined Tactical Matrices. If you like fire at will builds, you are going to want Entwined Tactical Matrices. Yes, I know redirecting arrays exists too, but redirecting arrays is stupid because it requires you to get shot at. Going back to the console slots on the Gagarin, this thing does have 5 engineering console slots plus that universal console slot. So those plus the 2 additional console slots if you upgrade this thing to Tier 6X2, that means this ship is a really great candidate for the advanced engineering ISOMAG consoles, having the potential to slot up to 8 of them at once. I know not everyone's into the ISOMAGs because of the grind it takes to earn them, but it's not as hard as it used to be, and they really are a huge benefit for energy weapon builds on engineering heavy cruisers like this. So if you're down for the ISOMAGs, this is a great platform for them. And it's made even better by the 4 tactical console slots that this ship has, meaning you can get up to 4 of the Protomatter Matrix Infuser consoles onto this thing, or 4 of the Bellum tactical consoles from the Discovery reputation. Those paired with 8 ISOMAGs, that's a lot of Cat 1 damage. Though honestly it's also kind of overkill, you'll probably want to mix in at least a few universal consoles. So anyway, while this is a really great platform for energy weapon builds and does have a nice starship trait for fire at will builds, there are some downsides to this ship. This ship actually has 2 commander level seats, a commander level on the engineering seat and a lieutenant level on one of the tactical seats. That's kind of a lot of Miracle Worker seating for one ship. While the Miracle Worker bridge officer abilities have some nice buffs to energy weapon builds, that really only consists of about 2 abilities. The rest of them are honestly kind of junk. Miracle Worker also doesn't have any abilities that trigger unconventional systems, so you're going to be a little hard-pressed for that. Though it's not too big of a deal on the Gagarin because you got that Universal Lieutenant Commander seat, which you can use for science, which has plenty of its own unconventional systems triggers. Another thing I've seen a lot of people talk about is that the Gagarin feels rather chunky for its size. And they're not wrong. The Gagarin's only about the size of a mid-sized cruiser, but it has a turn rate of 7.5 and an impulse modifier of 0.15. So it really isn't the most maneuverable ship at impulse speeds, even compared to some other cruisers. Oh, before we move on, I should probably mention that the Gagarin also has a Klingon variant, the Kuj Miracle Worker Battlecruiser. It comes with the same console and trait, and its stats are virtually identical to the Gagarin's. However, the Kuj does have a battle cloak, so if that's important to you and you don't mind the Discovery Klingon aesthetic, maybe that's a better choice for you. Next on the list is the Bozeman Intel Heavy Frigate. Being an Intel ship, this thing will be really nice for energy weapon builds, though for different reasons than the Miracle Worker ships are. The Bozeman also has a 5-3 layout, so it is also ideal for forward-facing builds. But frigates are a unique type of cruiser because they're actually a bit more similar to raiders, meaning they have an abundance of universal bridge officer seating and have access to the innate ability Raider Flanking. All that universal seating means you'll have a great deal of flexibility with your bridge officer powers, and with raider flanking you'll deal additional damage against an enemy's rear arc. So you'll have to keep your positioning more in mind when shooting at an enemy target, because you'll want to be on its rear arc to do more damage, but with how fast and maneuverable this thing is, that shouldn't be a problem. The drawback with frigates is that they're rather squishy, lacking a lot of the survivability that most other cruisers will have, though it'll still be able to take a bit more of a punch than most escorts. Another downside is that while it does have a cloaking device, due to the fact that it is a full intel ship, this is only a standard cloak, which is nowhere near as useful as a full-fledged battle cloak. The Bozeman does come with a really nice console called Tachyon Net Drones. This console's passive has some decent buffs to crit chance and crit severity. The clickability generates a decent-sized AoE around a target, and anything caught within that field will gain a decent debuff, making this a nice, well-rounded console for any kind of damage build or even support build, because the damage resistance debuff will be applied to the targets themselves, so anyone shooting at them will deal extra damage, hence the support part. The Bozeman also has a rather weird starship trait on it. Traditionally, starship traits are always some sort of passive buff, but the Bozeman starship trait is an active click ability called Active Temporal Surge. So really it functions more like a console or bridge officer ability. It's not the most amazing trait in the world. It provides impressive buffs to crit chance, turn rate, and flight speed for a short period of time, but it only lasts for about 10 seconds and then it has a 40-second recharge time, and for a starship trait, that's really not the greatest, but at the same time, it's not terrible either. So if you're lacking some of the more high-end DPS traits and you're wanting to improve your crit chance, turn rate, or flight speed at short durations, this might be a good trait for you. Also, keep in mind the Bozeman is another ship that does have a fleet ship version, so if you're going to want to be flying this ship around, you will need access to a fleet. Oh, it's also worth mentioning that the Bozeman is a variant of the Miranda class, and as we all know at this point, the Miranda is the king of Space Barbie in Star Trek Online, so if you like having a lot of customization options for your ship's visuals, any version of the Miranda is always a good option. Next up is the Grissom Light Science Vessel. This one's probably not going to be high on a lot of people's lists. I don't think that science builds are particularly popular among the more casual player base, just because of how difficult and expensive they are to set up. But I did want to include at least one science ship on this list just because I know if I didn't, people will yell at me. And while it might be funny to think that the Tier 6 Oberth of all ships is actually one of the better science ships available in the C-Store, it actually is. And that's largely due to the fact that this is a temporal ship. Temporal always goes really nicely with any sort of science build. Another plus to this ship is that it comes with a very powerful meta torpedo build console, Phased Space Membrane. So while you're probably not going to want to use that console on this ship, if you like torpedo builds, you're going to want that console. And of course, since this is an Oberth class, buying and flying this ship will obviously annoy Ambassador Kale. You know, they say every time you hit ready ship on an Oberth class, Kale can feel it in his mind, and it drives him closer and closer to madness. Anyway, moving on to the downsides of this ship, every ship has them. One is that the ship is very squishy, which shouldn't be that surprising. There is the constantly recurring meme in Star Trek that the Oberth is made of explodium. And while that is not quite the case in Star Trek Online, it is still a very squishy ship, and you will have to be very mindful of survivability. The bridge officer seating is also a bit heavy in engineering, more so than I would normally like on a science vessel like this. It would have been nicer if they had added another specialization seat to that engineering seat, but nope, it only has the one, which is the other downside of this thing. It only has the one specialization seat, being that one temporal seat. Not an uncommon thing on a C-Store ship, it's just it would have been nice to have a second specialization seat to kind of improve that engineering seat a bit. Now, there are other temporal science ships in the C-Store as well, like the Nautilus or the Augur, which are very similar to each other, and the Eternal, which is pretty nice too. But one of the main reasons I did pick the Grissom is because of that meta torpedo build console. But if you're not into torpedo builds and you're really just interested in setting up like an EPG build, but you're not feeling the Grissom, then you might want to check out one of those science ships instead. Or check out the honorable mention section, I bring up one more science vessel there too. It's also worth noting that the Grissom is also available in the new Genesis bundle in the C-Store. This bundle comes with the Grissom, another starship, the Clark, and a number of TMP-era exclusives that will be made account unlock through the bundle, including 3 different Wrath of Khan-era uniforms, as well as the Wrath of Khan-era phaser pistol, all of which used to be exclusive to the Low-Buy store. So if you really like your Wrath of Khan Space Barbie, the new Genesis bundle might be a better option for you, assuming you want to spend that kind of money. Moving on to not just my favorite ship in the C-Store, but my favorite playable ship in all of Star Trek Online, the Terran Lexington Dreadnought Cruiser. The Lexington really is just a fun ship to fly, in my opinion. It's a dreadnought, so it has both a hangar bay and a spinal lance. It's a full Miracle Worker ship, so it's great for energy weapon builds. And it has 5 engineering slots plus that universal, so you've got plenty of room for ISO mags if you want to go that route. It's a fairly large ship compared to most in Star Trek Online, especially in comparison to most in the C-Store. So if you're like me and you like big ships, that's a plus. And another plus is that it's actually surprisingly maneuverable for a dreadnought, having a turn rate of 8 degrees per second. Remember that the Gagarin is like half this thing's size and has a turn rate of only 7.5. It's also worth mentioning that the Lexington is a variant of the Odyssey class and therefore can use the updated Odyssey class skin, which means it's gorgeous. The ship comes with some decent toys as well. Its consular trait never really stood out too much in the meta, but they are still decent if you're lacking some of the more high-end stuff. The trait is decent for some extra bonus damage for a short duration based on your distance to your target. So the closer you are to your target, the more damage you'll be doing, which frankly you should already be doing with this ship because you'll have access to narrow sensor bands, which works the same way. And the console is also good for short durations of more bonus damage buffs. It's a bit better for a torpedo build because it deals some kinetic damage because it works with firing torpedoes in every direction, but the bonus damage buff applies to all damage, so you can make it work for pretty much anything. Lexington also unlocks some decent pets, coming equipped with the Mirror Universe Shuttlecraft. The elite version of these shuttles are capable of using Tractor Beam and Beam Overload 3. The fact that they already have such a high-level firing mode built into them means you don't need to have superior area denial to make them effective. Though it is also the same story with the Type 7 shuttlecraft off of the Ahwahnee command carrier, and honestly I would rather have a hangar bay of those than I would these. But more on those later, these are still really nice if you don't have the Type 7s. Oh, I forgot to mention the bridge officer seating on this thing. So it is a primary Miracle Worker ship, so it does have a Miracle Worker seat on the Commander Engineering seat, but unlike the Gagarin, this thing has a secondary Intel seat, meaning you'll have some more interesting options with your specialization seating. Intel also tends to be really good with energy weapon builds, so Intel and Miracle Worker tend to synergize really well together. So, it's great for an energy weapon build, it's got some fun toys built into it, and it's gorgeous, which is a lot of the reason why this is my favorite ship to play. But, just like any ship, it does have one flaw. And in the Lexington's case, that comes in the form of its weapons layout, having a 4-4 weapons layout. This is why I tend to run the Lexington as a broadside build rather than a forward-facing build, but because of that Miracle Worker seating and having access to mixed armament synergy, you can make forward-facing builds work on this thing. This next ship is, in a lot of ways, kind of the exact opposite of the Lexington, but it's still a really good ship. The Terran Adamant Intel Heavy Raider. So, the reason to like a dreadnought like the Lexington is that they're big, they're large, and they can take a decent punch while dealing out a decent amount of damage as well. But for a small raider like the Adamant here, you're going to want to be small, fast, maneuverable, and hard to see, but still deal out a lot of damage while doing so. And the Adamant is perfectly capable of doing all of that. This ship is a bit similar to the Bozeman, which we looked at earlier, and that's because both have an abundance of universal seating and have access to raider flanking, and that's because the Adamant is a true raider. So the difference between the two is that the Bozeman is a frigate, so it has a commander engineering seat, whereas the Adamant here is an escort, so it will have a commander tactical seat. Some of the other differences between this and the Bozeman are that the Adamant has a battle cloak on it. It has a secondary temporal seat, so Intel plus temporal means you are going to have a lot of room for unconventional systems triggers. And it has a 5-1 weapons layout, which may seem like a downgrade compared to other escorts, which typically would have like a 5-2. But that raider flanking does do a decent job of making up for only having one aft weapon slot. At the same time, this is why raiders with only 4-2 weapons layouts, like the legendary Klingon Bird of Prey, kinda suck. A forward weapon slot is much more important than an aft weapon slot. And it's an escort, so it still has that experimental weapon slot too. So, the Adamant is great for energy weapons because it's an Intel ship, and because it's an Intel ship, you can actually put on surgical strikes, so that's your hard-hitting aspect if you want to go in that direction. It's got loads of room for unconventional systems triggers, so you'll be able to get the cooldowns of your universal consoles lowered. It has a battle cloak, so it'll be hard to see if you use that properly. And just by the nature of being a raider, it'll be small and maneuverable. So like I said, it's going to be a very different playstyle than what you would expect on a dreadnought like the Lexington, but if you're into this sort of thing, this is definitely a very good platform for it. Another upside to the Adamant is that it comes with a very powerful console, though also one with a rather checkered history. The Agony Redistributor. When this console first came out, it was insanely powered. In fact, it was overpowered. It was stupid amounts of powerful. It really did need to be toned down a bit. But what Cryptic instead did was just left it alone for several months and then just out of nowhere nerfed it into the ground. This angered a lot of people who had bought this ship because there was no communication about it whatsoever, and it had happened so long after, a lot of us had assumed that they were just going to leave it alone. And then out of nowhere, boom, nerfed into obscurity. After the outcry from players, there were some attempts to tweak it, and it took them a while, but now these days it's at a good state where it's not stupid OP, but it is still useful in the current state of the meta for DPS builds. Now, for the cons of this build, obviously this is going to be a rather squishy ship, but also it comes with an absolutely terrible starship trait. Wild Weasel is effectively the starship version of Marty McFly pointing behind Biff and shouting, "What the hell is that?" just so he can get the chance to sucker punch him. Except it works like crap in Stowe. Oh, actually there's one more upside that I almost forgot about this ship. So, you know the phaser quad cannons that come off of, I think it's the tier 4 version of the Defiant? The Adamant comes with an Agony Phaser quad cannon. They work exactly the same as the original quad cannons, except that they have the Agony Phaser proc instead of the standard phaser proc. The Agony version is even incorporated into the same set bonuses as the original phaser quad cannon. Though this means you can't equip both at the same time, it's one or the other, the Agony version is still better. And even without those set bonuses, it is still a nice weapon to have for a cannon build. Next one on the list, which is, weirdly enough, another Raider. The Terran Eagle Pilot Raider. So, obviously there are going to be some similarities between this ship and the one we were just looking at, the Adamant. They're both Raiders, so they have an abundance of universal seating and have access to Raider flanking. They're also both small, maneuverable, squishy ships with 5-1 weapons layouts. But that's about where the similarities end, because while the Adamant was really good for an energy weapon build, the Terran Eagle here is actually one of the best platforms in the game for a torpedo build. One of the reasons that the Eagle makes such a good platform for torpedo builds is because of that secondary Lieutenant Commander command seat, meaning it has enough room for Concentrate Firepower 3, which is a key for a proper torpedo build. The primary specialization is Pilot, which really doesn't feed into the torpedo theme at all, but it is good for generating more speed, which is certainly useful on this ship given how small and squishy it is. Another reason it's so well suited for torpedo builds is because of its weapons layout. This thing has a very forward-facing focus, having a 5-1 weapons layout. The torpedo meta in the past was to have either a 4-4 layout or like a 4-3 layout if you were on an escort. That way you could support more mines in the back. But that all changed with the introduction of the Maelstrom torpedoes. After that, you wanted to have your 4 usual meta torpedoes, and then throw a Maelstrom torpedo into that 5th slot. Don't get me wrong, mines are still very powerful on a torpedo build, it's just you really can't beat the power of a Maelstrom torpedo. And if I were using a torpedo build on a larger ship like the World Razor, for example, which has a 5-3 weapons layout, I would still put a decent amount of focus on mines just for that extra kinetic damage. But with the Eagle only having the 1 weapon slot, you're not going to have a lot of damage from mines, because you're only going to have the 1 mine launcher. So lately what I've been doing with it is, instead of putting a mine launcher in the back, put a second Maelstrom in the back. Because this thing is more than maneuverable enough to pull a quick U-turn and then poop out a torpedo spread of Maelstroms out of the back, just for the sake of having an extra spike of Maelstrom damage. It's not a strategy that I think everyone would like, but it's definitely one that'll work on this ship. There's a few other reasons why this thing is so good for torpedo builds, and one is that it has an enhanced battle cloak. What makes this different from a normal battle cloak is that an enhanced battle cloak will allow you to still fire projectile weapons while the cloak is active. So you can just turn on your enhanced battle cloak and then just leave it on while you're running a torpedo build, and you will still have access to all of your weapons. Or really the smarter thing to do would be to keep turning it off and on in order to get as many hits of ambush as you possibly can, because ambush gives bonus damage. The ship also has a console, a trait, and even an experimental weapon that are really good for a torpedo build. The console is capable of reducing the shared cooldown of your torpedoes, to the point that it has completely replaced ferrofluidic assembly from the torpedo meta. You can use that console on most any ship and it'll give the same amount of cooldown reduction as you would with the ferrofluidic, but the console is even better on this ship specifically because it'll reduce the shared cooldown even lower if it's equipped to a ship with full pilot maneuvers. And this is the only ship with pilot maneuvers that you're going to want to be running a torpedo build. Starship trait and the experimental weapon take this to an even bigger extreme. While they are both very good for a torpedo build, they're really only good for a torpedo build on this ship specifically. Because the trait can give extra hits of torpedo spread, but needs a cloaking device and pilot maneuvers in order to work. And while the experimental weapon isn't actually a projectile weapon, it will still function while an enhanced battle cloak is active. So you'll still want to use that weapon on this ship just for the sake of it being able to fire while your enhanced battle cloak is active. So I guess that one would be decent on any escort with an enhanced battle cloak, but again, there aren't many of those. In fact, the only other one I can think of is the legendary Talis. So yeah, this ship is really great for a small, stealthy, really hard-hitting torpedo build, but at the same time, a lot of the stuff that it comes with is really only viably usable on this ship alone. They're not restricted or anything, they're just really only suited to certain setups that you're not going to see on a lot of other ships. Moving on, next is the Terran Hydra Intel Destroyer. Now, I'll be honest, this one probably isn't as good as the Adamant, because they're both Intel ships, they can both do a lot of similar things. But with the Adamant being smaller, faster, and having a better bridge officer layout, I feel like more people are going to gravitate more toward that. At least if they're just looking for DPS. But honestly, I find the Hydra to be a more fun ship just because of the weird toys it comes with. Because this is a ship that you could set up a viable pet build on without having any hangar bays. So the basics on this ship, it's an Intel Destroyer, it's got a 521 weapons layout, it's really heavy on the tactical consoles, but it still has 3 engineering, so you get this thing up to T6X2, you can get a decent amount of isomags on it. Though if you're going for surgical strikes on this thing, you'll want to stick with the vulnerability exploiters from the Spire. But the really interesting thing about this ship is all the pet stuff that it comes with. Its console, Engage the Hydra, is capable of teleporting any pets nearby to you, and then they will just shoot out a big burst of phaser damage out of them. The more pets triggered by the console, the more bursts of phaser damage you get, so you're going to want to have a good number of them. I think it maxes out at like 6 though. The Hydra is capable of producing some of those pets because it is capable of using the multi-vector assault mode, because this is a variant of the Prometheus. Now, the Hydra console itself does come with a sort of like dummy version of multi-vector assault mode. It'll only give you one version of the ability, so you'll only be able to command the saucer section instead of being able to pick between the 3 like you would with the normal multi-vector console. And it only lasts for about 60 seconds, which is why I still like to use the original multi-vector console off of the old Tier 5 Prometheus on this thing. That only accounts for 2 pets, so this thing also comes with a unique experimental weapon, which also spawns more pets. Well, sort of. They function kind of like a mix between turret pets and mines. They'll just sit around firing a little phaser turret that doesn't really deal any damage, it's just kind of meant to probe the enemy to make sure its shields are still up or not. And if it fires on an enemy with a down to shield facing, it'll then just rush at them and then explode. Amusing but not very powerful experimental weapon, but because those pets have their own engine, they will work with the Hydra console. And additionally, you can spawn in more pets with your bridge officer seating. The Hydra does have a pilot seat, so it is capable of using Reinforcement Squadron, and you also have the option to use Construction Shuttle Wing on here, both of which will spawn pets that will work with the Hydra console. This starship's trait also is really good for pets, giving bonus damage to those pets depending on their size and classification. It'll give a 30% bonus damage to normal fighter pets, which that's not just hangar pets, that will include any fighter-sized pet that you have under your command, including those summoned by Reinforcement Squadron. Any frigate-sized pets get 40% bonus damage, and multi-vector or any kind of separation pets will get 50% bonus damage. So this pet console was designed with the multi-vector assault mode in mind. Now, obviously a lot of this stuff would be more useful on a ship with an actual hangar bay or 2, which is why I really do wish the Hydra was a strike wing escort, not just a normal destroyer, but it can still work. And that's kind of the impressive thing about the whole setup on this ship. So beside it not having a hangar bay, the only other real downside to this ship is that it does have a cloaking device, but it is only a standard cloaking device. So again, no battle cloak. Moving on to yet another Intel escort. Man, I really put a lot of Intel ships on this list, didn't I? Anyway, the Cyclone Intel Patrol Escort. This one's another Intel escort. It's got a 5.2 weapons layout, so it's going to be good for energy weapon builds, particularly forward-facing energy weapon builds. This one does have a battle cloak, which is nice. The Cyclone is a solid ship, but honestly, in terms of Intel escorts, it's kind of bland to some of the other Intel ships that we've already looked at. So you might be asking why we're talking about this, and the main reason is because of its experimental weapon, the Gull-type Psionic Resonator. This experimental weapon is widely regarded as the second most powerful experimental weapon in the game, and it is the most powerful one that you'll be able to obtain as an account unlock. The most powerful one being Plasma Incendiary Bombardment off of the Gorn Hunter Pilot Raider, which is a lockbox ship. Honestly, I was genuinely surprised when that happened because I never thought anything would unseat Soliton Wave Impeller. And don't get me wrong, Soliton is still a solid experimental weapon choice, but this is performing a bit better. Especially because a lot of us are running with more levels in auxiliary power than engine power these days, largely due to the release of stuff like the Ahwahnee's console. And to get the most out of Soliton Wave Impeller, you want your access power in your engine power, not somewhere else. So the Cyclonic Resonator really is the better option at this point. The Cyclone also comes with a pretty nice console, Sensor Phantom Projector. Its passive is capable of giving substantial bonus damage buffs when firing on an enemy's rear arc. That stacks with Raider flanking, by the way, so this would actually go really well with either of those Raiders or with the Bozeman. But what the click ability on this thing does is summon a Phantom Sensor copy of your ship. It'll taunt enemies and draw fire toward it. effectively being a sort of dummy tank and is a great way of getting threat off of you. The trait's pretty decent too, depending on what sort of specialization bridge officer abilities you have. It's nothing super powerful, but it's a reasonably well-rounded trait that you can use in place of other high-end traits that you might not have. I really wish it had a longer duration though. 7 seconds is not a long time. So, while this is a pretty good ship with some pretty good stuff on it, honestly, I do find it to be kind of unremarkable compared to some of the other ships that we've looked at already. To me, the main selling point of this ship is the experimental weapon, and to a somewhat lesser extent, the console. It's by no means a bad ship, it's just there are so many other similar ships just on this list alone, and I would take any of those over this one. Because they all have something a bit more unique about them, whereas this is just a standard escort with double intel seating. Well, maybe not totally standard, the battle cloak is still a nice touch. The only other real downside I could think of for this ship was that it has a serious lack of engineering console slots. The fleet version only has 2 engineering console slots, so the only way isomags are going to be of any use on this thing is if you upgrade the ship up to tier 6x2. Though, of course, if you are going for surgical strikes on this build, which you absolutely could because it is an intel ship, that won't be a concern because you'll want to stick with the vulnerability exploiters in that case. Surgical strikes is all about crit severity. Next up is one of the most recent ships added to the game, the Atlantis Temporal Destroyer. I called it pretty early that the Atlantis was going to be the all-star of the 14th anniversary bundle, and I still stand by that opinion. This is a fantastic escort for any kind of energy weapon build, but particularly if you like beam overload. Its mix of a commander-level temporal and lieutenant commander intel seat make for a lot of room for unconventional systems triggers, but also give you the option to use some very powerful abilities, not just for unconventional systems. Like Recursive Shearing 3 to get some extra bonus damage out of pretty much everything that hits the target, or Override Subsystem Safeties 3 to get a bunch of extra power to all of your subsystems. Which, by the way, OSS is one of the few things that will also stack with the isomags. The Atlantis does have a 5-2 weapons layout with an experimental weapon, so it is really good for a forward-facing build, which is good because a lot of the temporal abilities are also forward-facing. One of the really interesting things about this ship, though, is that while it is very well suited to an energy weapon build, you could also redirect this into a more DUSI focus. DUSI being short for Directed Energy Weapon / Science build. So instead of dealing just mostly energy weapon damage, you'd be dealing more of a mix of energy weapon and exotic damage, like radiation, physical, or electrical damage. And its console is actually well suited for that sort of setup because it does deal a decent amount of physical damage, along with giving nice buffs to your energy weapons. The Starship trait, however, is a bit more focused on just energy weapons, giving a very impressive buff to firing cycle haste for a short amount of time every time you use a temporal ability or attack pattern beta. It's basically a better version of Heart of Soul, which is part of the reason why the temporal warships got bumped off the list. Moving on to the downsides, one of which I forgot to write down, the experimental weapon on this thing, it's kinda crap. The way it's worded, you would think it's actually really good for a DUSI build, but nope. Just use the Cyclones, it's way better. Speaking of the Cyclone, like it, this thing only has 2 engineering console slots, so unless you get this thing up to tier 6x2, it's really not going to be that great for isomags. Unlike the Cyclone, the Atlantis is not a full intel ship, it is a temporal ship, so Surgical Strikes 3 is not an option here. Though I guess one other upside compared to the Cyclone is that this does not have a fleet version, so there's no need to upgrade it to fleet status. It's already got it, technically. And the last ship we'll be talking about on this list, which I kind of already spoiled earlier, the Ahwahnee Command Carrier. Now, stats-wise, this one's probably not going to impress a lot of people because this is a standard science carrier, meaning it has a very science-leaning console layout and bridge officer seating, a 3-3 weapons layout, but no secondary deflector. But even with the shortcomings of a standard carrier, you can still get a solid build on this thing. In fact, I already did it. One of the unique things about the Ahwahnee is that while it is a standard science carrier, they still gave this thing 5 engineering console slots, which means it's very well suited to use the advanced engineering consoles, and in this case I don't mean isomags, I mean the hangar bay consoles. So you really do have the option to feed more into a pet build for this ship. However, the Ahwahnee's real value here is more in what it comes with than the ship itself. The Ahwahnee's console, Fleet Power Network Array, is capable of giving substantial buffs to energy weapon firing cycle haste. This can range from a 50% buff to a 125% buff, which will scale with your auxiliary power levels. This is why we've been throwing excess power into auxiliary instead of engines lately, because that is a lot of haste, and it lasts for a long time too, because this console's active ability has a duration of 35 seconds. It gets even better though, because this console's ability applies not just to yourself, but also to any of your hangar pets that you might have. So if you like energy weapon builds, you're going to want this console. If you like pet builds, you're going to want this console even more. It also has the chance to randomly trigger certain firing modes while it's active. Now, it isn't supposed to override your bridge officer firing modes, but currently it is overriding most of them, except fire at will for some reason. So yeah, hopefully that'll get fixed soon. It's kind of the same story with the Starship trait on this thing. It's a decent trait that gives some extra firing cycle haste anytime you use a heal ability or anytime you use a command ability. Well, certain command abilities that also heal. I'm not sure if that's a bug or not too. But it's also resetting the cooldowns on consoles when it's supposed to. So again, decent trait, but it's broken right now, and hopefully that'll get fixed soon. Another thing to look at on these things is the pets, the new Type 7 shuttlecraft. These things are crazy with the amount of debuff they give, being able to use attack pattern beta and a new ability called close sensor pass. Like, seriously, the amount of debuff that these pets are able to generate is absolutely insane. But the really insane part about it is that they're also bugged. Because the elite versions are supposed to be able to use attack pattern beta 3, but right now they're only using attack pattern beta 1 still. So once those hopefully get fixed, that debuff is going to get even more insane. Though with how insane it is, I'm honestly a little worried they're going to start nerfing these. Which honestly might not be a bad thing if they're already doing so much with just attack pattern beta 1. So maybe they can just leave it there and call it even, but who knows. For now, these are very good pets, and once they're fixed, they'll be even better pets, assuming no other changes are made. But even if changes are made, I would still bet on these being very useful pets because of the amount of debuff they're able to put out. And one more thing you guys might like about this is that the elite versions are able to use Fire at Will 1, meaning you don't really need superior area denial for these pets. No need to give them Fire at Will when they already have Fire at Will. So in terms of downsides, besides the stuff that's kind of broken on this ship still, the real downside to this ship is that it was just a standard carrier, when I feel like a lot of people would have preferred a flight deck carrier. And really, a flight deck carrier would have made more sense to me because this is meant to be the Tier 6 version of the Constellation and the Cheyenne class. The original versions of both of those ships were Tier 3 cruisers. So it would have made more sense for the Ahwahnee to be what is effectively the more engineering type carrier, meaning a flight deck carrier. Though at the same time, even if it was a flight deck carrier, I feel like some people would still complain about it because of its console layout, only having one tactical console slot. It's a very unusual move, but at the same time, I do kind of get it and honestly kind of respect it because it is definitely an interesting shakeup on just carriers in general. And that's because it kind of forces you into a build type that focuses on what I've always felt that carriers were supposed to be, and that's that they're supposed to be supporting the fighters that they launch. I really like that sort of thinking because it's a playstyle that I've really wanted to see happen in Star Trek Online for a while that I've finally been able to pull off. But there are still improvements that could be made, one of which that I think needs to happen is an innate buff to hangar pet damage on normal science carriers like this. Just something to give the pets a bit more of an edge than they would have on other ships with hangar bays. Because flight deck carriers and dreadnought carriers are not having the same struggles that normal science carriers are having. I know a lot of people say, just put a secondary deflector on it, but no, that's not the answer. That just turns them all into science ships. A carrier needs to be exactly what it says it is. It needs to be a carrier. Okay, this rant is going on long enough to the point that, honestly, I should probably just make it into its own video, so we're going to wrap this up here. So, in the end, the Ahwahnee is a decent ship that allows for a unique style of gameplay, one that is very pet-focused, but no matter what your style of gameplay is, you're probably going to want the console and the pets off of it. However, those two things really are the only selling points for this ship. And before we wrap up, we've got some honorable mentions because even though I call these top 10 lists, I can never help myself. First is the Arbiter Battlecruiser, which is really only here because of its Starship trait, Emergency Weapon Cycle. This has been part of the energy weapon meta since this ship was introduced, but the ship itself really hasn't aged all that well. And the same goes for its Klingon and Romulan counterparts, the Kurok and the Morrigu. And it's also worth noting that this Starship trait is now available in 2 different legendary bundles. The Legendary First Strike bundle on the Legendary Valdor, and the Legendary Battlecruiser bundle on the Legendary Avenger. I think either of those options would be a better bang for your buck, but at the same time, you can't buy a legendary ship with a T6 coupon. So just going straight for the Arbiter might be more appealing to more casual players if you haven't already. Next is the Clark Multi-Mission Command Cruiser. I wanted to at least bring this one up because it is a solid tanking platform. Now, to be fair, you can tank in pretty much any kind of cruiser with the right setup, so tanking really isn't that extraordinary of a thing. Not unless you're going for super high-end support tanks, which I really don't think is something the average player is doing. But if you are wanting to go in that direction, this is a decent option for that. Though if you're not super into this ship, you may also want to look at the Justiciar or the Baran. But one of the reasons I called out this ship specifically is because this also comes with a meta EPG console. Genesis Seed. Ever wanted to hurl a planet at your enemy? That's the way to do it. Also, remember the new Genesis bundle that I brought up when talking about the Grissom? This is the other ship in that bundle. Next one worth talking about is the Somerville Intel Science Vessel. I wanted to bring up this one, and the next one actually, just because I know the list was very light on science ships. Frankly, I find the Somerville stats to be a bit dated at this point, especially for an EPG build, because really anything without temporal really doesn't do that well for EPG. I mean, you can make it work in the same way you can make anything work, but you really want that temporal seating for an EPG build. But the thing that makes the Somerville noteworthy is that it has a meta EPG starship trait, Spore-Infused Anomalies. So if you like sciencey space magic builds, you're going to want to pick up this ship for its starship trait. And the last ship that I thought was worth mentioning is the recently released Chekhov Intel Science Warship. Now, while the Chekhov is still an Intel ship, it does have a secondary temporal seat. So that, coupled with the science seat, it's actually quite good for EPG and DoSci. But I decided not to add this one to the list because both of those build types are kind of expensive and difficult to put together. I feel like the average player base is more into just average weapons-based builds, kind of like I am. But if you're wanting to get more into the sciencey space magic stuff, this is definitely a ship to look at. So yeah, those are my picks for the top 10 C-Store ships in Star Trek Online as of March of 2024, plus some honorable mentions. I hope you found this list helpful. Once I finish up this, I'm going to get to work on updating the top 10 choices for premium ships to pick for the event campaign this year, which I imagine some of you are going to be pretty interested in, given the updates to this year's event campaign, letting you pick all 3 prizes instead of just 1. So yeah, that should be on its way soon, but while you're waiting, be sure to comment down below what you thought of this list, and while you're down there, be sure to like and subscribe and hit that bell for notifications. If you would like to further support the channel, you can hit that join button down below to become a member of the channel, or if you're ever shopping on the Epic Game Store, be sure to use my content creator code STU1701, or if you're ever shopping on real merch for Star Trek Eaglemoss models, be sure to use my discount code over there, which is also STU1701. Using either of those codes in those locations really helps me out, so I do appreciate that. But either way, thank you so much for watching. My name's Stu, and I will see you guys next time.